Leviticus chapter 2. Let's see where we are here. Let me see if that comes up. It does. We started Leviticus last week. Now, you'll want to know this in case you are new to Leviticus. We just started chapter 1 last week. And the reason we're in Leviticus is because we went through Genesis. We started Genesis a long time ago. Exodus, and then from Exodus right into Leviticus. In Exodus and Leviticus, there's really no break. They are called they've got two different names, but it's the same group of people. It's the children of Israel who have been rescued from slavery in Egypt. And now they're traveling towards something called the Promised Land that God is going to get them to eventually. And where they're at right now is they are in the wilderness of Sinai, at Mount Sinai. They're at this mountain. And Moses has been up on the mountain meeting with God. And God's been giving him all kinds of incredible information. 10 Commandments came from there. And what God did was he also gave him some instructions on how to build something called the tent of meeting, or the tabernacle of meeting. Okay? And the tabernacle of meeting, its entire purpose was for God to be able to meet with his people. It was a place that they could go and sacrifice there to God. And so where we're at right now is the tabernacle. The instructions were all given. The tabernacle's been erected. Now begins the instructions for the sacrifices that people will do when they go to the tabernacle. Okay? And again, the whole purpose of the tabernacle was to meet with God. The whole purpose of the sacrifices is because people could not just go to God on their own, just whenever they wanted to. That is a very foreign idea for you and I, those of us that have been Christians for a long time. Many of you, I know, grew up in Christian homes, and so the idea of talking to God at any time is like, well, duh, everybody does that. But not everybody does that outside of this room, or outside of this church, or outside of your Christian friends. Not everybody knows that or does that. I got saved when I was 20 years old, and that means prior to that, I was not saved. And prior to that, I thought that I was a Catholic. I say I thought because I really hardly ever went to church unless it was special events like weddings, funerals, quinces, baby baptisms, and then and those happened, throughout the year sometimes. And then I would also go once a year for sure on Christmas Eve for their midnight mass. It's like that's their name for service. I would go there midnight mass Christmas Eve, and the service would be in Latin. Okay, in Latin. And it was over on the west side of San Bernardino, which is all Hispanic families, and many of them Spanish speakers. But even the mass itself was not in Spanish. It was done in Latin because it was a special service. And so, I barely speak any Spanish at all. I know enough just to find out where the restaurant is or the food is. And I really don't know much other than that. So what was I doing in a Latin mass? Good question. What I was doing was, in my mind, I had this idea. In my mind, because I do not understand Latin, and because church is so dang boring, if I go on Christmas Eve and I sit through a Latin Mass, I'm gaining points with God because I'm there suffering. That was my thought. I'm going there, I'm suffering, and so I'm gaining points with God. And so hopefully, and then the overarching idea was that hopefully at the end of my life when I die, I've sat through enough boring church services, or I've done enough good works to outweigh my bad works, and hopefully I can get myself into something called purgatory. Anybody ever heard of purgatory? Yeah, a couple of you have. Okay. Purgatory was in between heaven and hell. I already knew I was not good enough to get into heaven. And what I'm now doing is, throughout my life, up until the time that I was 20, I'm hoping that I can do enough good works to keep me out of hell, get me into purgatory. Because if I get into purgatory, then my family who's still alive, I've died, I'm in purgatory, then my family who's still alive can pray prayers and even pay money to, basically like you're getting them out of prison. They could get me out of purgatory and get me into heaven eventually. And so that was my thought. So the thought of going to God directly was very foreign to me. When I went to church, rarely when I went, it was prayer to the saints. They had different forms. They might be statues, they might be pictures, they might be candles, they might be stained glass. And I would pray to those things, those items, in order to find me favor with God. That's what I was doing. I was praying to the statue or lighting a candle with a saint on it in order to get me closer to God. I did not understand, I did not know that Jesus had given me access to God so that I could go to God directly. I did not know any of that. And so many of you have grown up in a Christian home, and that's just what you do. You just always talk to God. You've always done that. When there's a math test coming up, you just talk to God in class. Or if you're in the bathroom and thinking about things that are going on, you're praying. You just pray to God. Or if you're in the car, or if you're on the soccer field or the basketball court, or you're in some kind of a church event, or you're at the supermarket, wherever you're at the mall, wherever you're at, you think of something, you pray. And it's just normal. It's just natural. It's just second nature. It's just what you do. I did not grow up that way. When I was your age, I did not know that. I was absolutely lost. And there were times when I was a teenager that I would drive myself to the Catholic Church to go look for someone to talk to because I wasn't saved. I was lost. I knew that in my heart. I knew that I was lost. And I would go there looking for someone that could give me some hope, that could talk to me and tell me that everything was going to be okay, or that there was some better way of living. And I would go there and I wouldn't find. I'd go during the day. I'd go looking around and like the church is closed. There's no one there. No one to talk to. And so I would leave empty, having not spoken with anybody, having left, and I don't have any hope. I don't know what's going to happen. Maybe I'll come back later, or maybe there'll be someone here. I did not know that you could just go directly to God. In the book of Hebrews, it says that you and I can approach the throne of grace with boldness. You and I can go to God's throne of grace at any time during the day, 24/7. In the morning when I wake up, at lunchtime when I'm eating at school, in the middle of the night when things are going wrong and I'm tossing and turning and I can't seem to sleep, I can cry out to God at any moment of the day. Free access from any point. I don't have to come to this brown shoebox just to talk to God. I don't even have to come to this church to talk to God. I don't have to wait until I get here on a Wednesday or a Sunday. I don't have to come and talk to Pastor Chris and say, hey, Pastor Chris, could you please talk to God for me? I don't have to do that. I just talk to God myself. And so the thought of that for many of us, for many of you, is very normal, very natural. It's just what we do. We just talk to God all the time. But it wasn't for me, and it's not for a lot of people. And these sacrifices now, God wants to meet with his people, and the people want to meet with God. There's a problem though. The problem is that the people are sinful and they can't just go to God. They can't just go there. And so they have to come. When they come, they can't come empty-handed. They've got to come with sacrifices. And so God is teaching his people. He's teaching his people how He's basically giving them this new religion. This is a brand new thing for them. These people have been in Egypt all of their lives. The Israelites were in Egypt for hundreds of years. The people that he's leading out of Egypt and into the promised land have never known anything other than Egypt. That's all they knew was slavery. That's all they knew. They did not know about this. And so now God is working Egypt. He's gotten his people out of Egypt. Now what he's doing is he's getting Egypt out of his people. He's showing them this new way of life, this new religion, and what it involves approaching God, talking to God, but you have to bring a sacrifice and you have to go through a priest. And we'll talk some more about that. Now, what we're going to do this morning, you thought we would never get to it, is we're going to go through two chapters, chapter 2 and 3, and you're thinking, oh my gosh, talk about suffering through church. You might as well be speaking Latin so I can gain some points to get closer to God. Chapter 2 is where we are going to spend the majority of our time this morning. Chapter 3 is going to move like lightning. It's going to be fast because chapter 3 is very repetitive. Okay? And so we won't need to read the entire chapter. We'll skip some. That's allowed. Okay? We won't go to hell for that. Leviticus chapter 2 and 3. We're going to see two different kinds of offerings. Now, last week we saw the burnt offering, or sometimes it's called the whole burnt offering. This morning, we're going to see the grain offering, which would involve the grain Okay? Studied all week to find that out. The peace offering, we'll see animals used once again. But let's look at the grain offering first of all, Leviticus chapter 2. Now, there are several different forms of how this grain offering could be presented. We pick it up at verse 1. When anyone offers a grain offering to the Lord, it's got to be offered to the Lord, obviously. His offering shall be of fine flour. Does everybody have the same thing there? Fine flour? Does anybody have anything different?
I got
Choice, okay. That was one that we had in the first service. Choice flour. And that's a good, I like that translation, and we'll talk about, we see two different things here in this fine flour. Now, first of all, does anybody know where flour comes from? Anybody know what flour is? Anybody ever see a bag of flour? Anybody? Yes? Okay. Some of you that might bake, or some of you that have been around the kitchen maybe a little bit, you're like, kitchen? That's where my mom lives. I don't ever go in there. Okay? Flour. Where does flour come from? Does anybody have a clue? Yes?
Wheat.
Ah, there it is. Thus, the grain offering. Okay? The grain offering, we're told, when anyone offers a grain offering to the Lord, his offering shall be of fine flour. We go, wait, I thought you said it was grain. Yeah, grain turned into flour. Now, does anybody know how it goes from grain to fine or choice flour? We're talking about two different words there. Let's deal with fine first. Fine flour. Does anybody know what that means? Anybody ever seen a bag of extra fine flour? You said no, but I saw an extra fine girl and she was, no. Extra fine flour. Does anybody know what that means? Yes, Nathan.
Would it be like ground up?
That's exactly what it would be. And you have flour, and you have fine flour, and you have extra fine flour. It's grain that has been ground up. It's been pounded. It's been processed. And extra fine flour is flour that's already been ground, and it's powder. But then they take it and they sift it some more and get out just the choice flour, the best. Okay? That's what we want. So in this verse, it says fine or choice flour. It actually means two different things. The fine flour would mean that it's in powder form now. But it also means that it's the choice flour. It's the good stuff. And when anyone offers a grain offering to the Lord, his offering shall be of fine flour. This is the first form of the grain offering. And we see the other two. There are only two other ingredients. Actually, there are three ingredients, but we'll see two of them here. We'll see the last one a little bit later. Verse 1, and he shall pour oil on it. This is no doubt, this no doubt would have been olive oil. Does anybody know where olive oil comes from? Yes. Pressed olives. Yes. Pressed olives. They take olives, squish them, get the liquid out of it, and they would use that. So the person that's bringing this grain offering should bring the grain in flour form, fine flour. It's been sifted, processed. And then he shall pour oil on it and put frankincense on it. Okay? Frankincense. Okay? Not Frankenstein. Frankincense. Now I want you to think of frankincense as frank incense. Anybody know what incense are? Anybody? Anybody know what incense are? Yeah?
Like a candle?
Kind of. Kind of. It's scented. Yes. Anybody else know what incense are? Anybody tell us what? It is. Yes. Incense take different forms. Okay. Sometimes you get incense sticks, but you light those puppies up, and they let off a little bit of smoke, and it lets off a scent. And sometimes it's a good scent, and sometimes it's a bad scent. It just depends on what your taste is. Depends on what you like. So they would bring fine flour, they would bring oil, and they would bring frankincense, and they would mix those together. Now, frankincense here is again, it's an incense. But does anybody remember hearing about frankincense in any other part of the Bible where it might have been used? What do you think? Anybody?
They brought in frankincense and myrrh.
Brought who?
Jesus.
They brought Jesus frankincense and myrrh. Remember that? And gold. They brought him those things when he had been born. He's then in a home, and the wise men show up and they bring those items to Jesus and to his family, to Joseph and Mary. And they were very expensive gifts, very expensive gifts. They brought them to this peasant family, Joseph and Mary. I don't know if you knew that, but Jesus was born into a peasant family. They were a poor family. And so these were special items here. So they were to mix all of these things together. And then they get some instruction in verse 2. He shall bring it to Aaron's sons. Why Aaron's sons? Well, they were the priests. One of the sons, shall take from it his handful of fine flour and oil with all the frankincense. So whichever priest would receive that fine flour, frankincense, oil, would take from it a handful. Okay? Sounds kind of gross. It's like, hey, dude, why are you sticking your hand in my offering? But these were the instructions. So I come to the tent of meeting. I come with my bowl or my container of a fine flour mixed with oil and some frankincense. I bring that, and what I do is I present that to the priest. The priest then gets a handful out of there, goes over to the altar. The altar is something that has wood in it, and there's fire, and it's burning. And the priest would then dump that handful onto the fire. It burns up. Now, I don't know what fine flour and this mixture does, other than it flames up because the fire would have been very, very hot. But did you guys know that powdered creamer is flammable? Okay, don't tell your mom I told you that, okay? But he shall bring it to Aaron's sons, the priests, one of whom shall take from it his handful of fine flour and oil with all the frankincense. Please don't blow your kitchen up trying that, okay? Because I can picture it already, like, TikTok challenge. You know, where did all this start? Some pastor in Menifee, I don't know, he told people to light their powdered creamer on fire. Please don't do that, okay? One of these days when we're having a bonfire, we'll bring some powdered creamer and do it there, okay? I regret telling you that so much. Verse 2, he shall bring it to Aaron's sons, the priests, one of whom shall take from it his handful of fine flour with all the frank. And the priest shall burn it as a memorial on the altar, an offering made by fire, a sweet aroma to the Lord. Now watch out. Verse 3, the rest of the grain offering shall be Aaron's and his sons. It is most holy of the offerings to the Lord made by fire. Now this is different from the burnt offerings. Does anybody remember how much of the animal was burned for the burnt offering?
All of it.
All of it, yes. That's why sometimes it was called the whole burnt offering. You'll remember that even the legs and the intestines, okay, if you're from Scotland, call them intestines. Even those things were washed and then they were burned. But everything's burned. Well, this is much different because this time you bring it to the priest. He grabs out a handful. He puts it on the fire. That's a memorial. That's been sacrificed to God. He then gets to keep the rest. And you go, wait a minute, that doesn't seem fair. Why does he get to take my offering? I'm trying to offer that stuff to the Lord. Well, a handful is all that God required. He did not require any more. You were to bring more than that, but a handful was all that he required for himself, and the rest of it was to go to the priest. Why did he do that? Well, that is one of his ways of providing for the priests. You see, I want you to think about this. There are potentially millions of Israelites living out there in this camp. And all of those families are coming to the tent of meeting to sacrifice because they either want to say sorry to God, or they want to say thank you to God, or they're bringing a peace offering, which we'll see a little bit later. It's all these different types of sacrifices. And if there are millions of people out there, you can imagine when do the sacrifices ever stop? They've got to just be going constantly. And the priests would have just been busy constantly. Now, maybe they went in shifts or whatever. Maybe we'll find that out later. But you can imagine it would have been overwhelming. So how is a priest, if he's serving God and serving the people, doing this, how in the world is he supposed to feed himself? He doesn't have time to go out to his house and grow his own crops. He can't go get a job at Stater Brothers. So how does he do it? He does it this way. God provides for the priests by saying you are going to get a portion of the sacrifice that they bring. Now, here's how my strange mind works. I'm thinking, oh, that's really cool. But how many people a day come with a grain offering? And how much fine flour, oil, and frankincense can I really use? That's a lot of food. And how in the world am I going to use all of that up? Now, I don't know. They didn't have refrigerators, so I don't know what they did with it. But that's a lot of food. And so you can see that God, through this, is providing for the priests. But there's a second way, a second form that it can be brought, and that is in verse 4. And if you bring as an offering a grain offering baked in the oven, okay? It shall be unleavened cakes of fine flour mixed with oil, or unleavened wafers anointed with oil. So this is an entirely different form. However, you'll notice verse 4, it doesn't give us more instructions because it's the same instructions. Same instructions. They will differ a little bit as we get into the next one, but it's generally the same idea. You bring it to the priest. Verse 4. And if you bring as an offering a grain offering baked in the oven. So you could actually, the first one, you're bringing fine flour mixed with oil, frankincense, you bring it in that form. And then the priest may do with it as he pleases. Verse 4, you've baked it already. Maybe you really like the priest. And you go, you know what, I really like Pastor Chris, and I'm just going to bring him some baked cookies. Or a pie. Or some kind of, I don't know, some kind of baked something, because Pastor Chris really likes baked stuff. So maybe instead of bringing me, like this handful of powder, maybe you just go ahead and bring me the baked goods. Well, in verse 4, we're told if they can bake it in an oven, but if they do that, it shall be unleavened cakes of fine flour mixed with oil, same ingredients, or unleavened wafers anointed with oil. So they could bring it from an oven, but it had to be either cakes or wafers. Okay? I prefer cakes. I'm not crazy about candy. It's okay. Snickers, peanut M&Ms, those types. I like chocolate and nuts mixed together. Okay? Did you want to know that? Oh well, I'm telling you, okay? But what I like even more than that, what I go crazy for, is baked stuff. Like cupcakes, brownies, cakes, pies, pumpkin pie, pecan pie, apple pie, cherry pie. I love all of those, okay? And I just wanted to share that with you in case you want to bring me some. Has nothing to do with what we're talking about here, okay? It's second service. I'm getting hungry. Verse 4, if you bring these, if they're baked in an oven, they have to be unleavened. Now, does anybody remember what leaven is? Yeah.
Yeast.
And it does what?
Rises. Makes rise.
Yeah. Yeah, so they would take that little bit of leaven or yeast, a pinch, which basically was like sourdough or rotten bread. And they would stick it in the loaf that they were baking, or whatever they were baking, and that's what would cause it to rise. Because when you're baking a cake, I know I grew up with a mom and two sisters, and now of course I'm married and I've got 3 daughters, and at times, there was baking going on. And you bake a cake and it comes out flat. Oh, my cake came out flat, I would hear, and it's like, okay, but don't throw it away, I'll still eat it, But you want that thing to rise. However, in this case, as God is saying, hey, if you bring the fine flour in this form, it's been baked in the oven, you need to make sure that it doesn't rise. It needs to be flat, unleavened cakes or unleavened wafers. Now, does anybody remember, why does God not want leaven in it? What is it about leaven? Yes?
Because, leaven is kind of a representation of sin.
Yes, it's a representation of sin, a picture of sin. And so the idea is that God is telling his people, listen, when you come to sacrifice, present your sacrifice to me, it's got to be without sin. You can't put leaven in it. This was something that God started with his people back in Exodus. If you were here for that, you'll remember the Passover, the night that they left Egypt. God gave them these instructions. You're going to eat this meal, and you're going to dress this way, and you're going to do these things. And then there was there was a feast attached to that, and that involved you can't have leaven. And so the mom would go around the house, and the family would look for leaven and they would clear out all the leaven. No leaven during that feast. You can't have any. So he's saying, listen, if you're going to bake it, make sure that there's no leaven in it. Cannot have leaven, because that is a picture of sin, and sin is not the picture that we want to give. Also, you'll want to remember that these sacrifices are a picture of Jesus, and Jesus was sinless, so we cannot have leaven in it. So there in verse 4. Now let's move on. Verses 5 and 6, we find out that you can also bring it baked in a pan. Maybe you don't have an oven. Maybe your oven's down. Or maybe you're waiting for the repairman. And so you say, you know what, we're going to bake it in a pan. It says in verse 5, but if your offering is a grain offering baked in a pan, it shall be of fine flour, unleavened, mixed with oil, same things. But this time in verse 6, you shall break it in pieces and pour oil on it. It is a grain offering. So you bake it in a pan, you slice that thing up, you put some, right here, you put some oil on it, and you present that. And then the priest can take pieces out, sacrifice those on the altar, and then the priest, he gets to take the rest of it. And that's already prepared, and he can eat it, and it's just good to go. Verses 7 down through the remainder, down to verse 13, sorry. From verses 7 to 13, we see that you can bring it baked in a covered pan. Anybody have anything different there? Verse 7, instead of a covered pan? No? Okay. Yes, what do you got?
Frying pan.
Yes, there it is. What this means is a frying pan. So if you don't have the fine flour and you don't have an oven and you cannot bake it in a pan, you can fry it in a pan and bring it that way. And I like the idea of that. I'm Hispanic. I like stuff fried. Okay? Verse 7, if your offering is a grain offering baked in a covered pan, it shall be made of fine flour with oil. We already know that. Okay? Verse 8, you shall bring the grain offering that is made of these things to the Lord. And when it is presented to the priest, he shall bring it to the altar. We know that. Then the priest, what's he going to do? He's going to take some of it off the memorial offering. He'll put a portion there. It is an offering, in verse 9, made by fire, a sweet aroma to the Lord. And in verse 10, and what is left of the grain offering in that form, baked in a covered pan, shall be Aaron's and his sons. It is most holy of the offerings to the Lord, made by fire. He goes on to say this in verse 11. No grain offering, none of these offerings, none of these. No grain offering which you bring to the Lord shall be made with leaven. We already know that. Good, let's move on. For you shall burn no leaven, nor any honey in any offering to the Lord made by fire. Now we know about leaven, but what about honey? Honey is forbidden, both because it turns to sourness and leads to fermentation. Anybody know what it means to ferment? Grapes ferment and turn into...
Isn't that where the yeast turns something into alcohol?
It basically means, that the item is rotting. You take these grapes that are rotting in this process and it turns into wine. It's the craziest thing. I don't know. I mean, I know you guys don't like hang out with people that have been in prison, but there's a big problem in the prisons where they'll take all of their fruit that they get for their meal, they'll stick it in a sack, and it goes rotten and turns into this nasty wine that they drink. I know that because my daughter, she works in a jail, and she'll tell me all these crazy stories, like they did what? They used what? Like, how did that happen? And they figure out all this stuff, but basically it's this process where it's rotting. And here he's saying that you can't add the honey in there, you can't have the leaven. We'll talk about the leaven in just a moment. But it's forbidden. Probably because it turns sour, it ferments, but also because it's a luxury. when I used to go to the Catholic Church, I knew that Jesus died for me because when I walked in, at the back behind the altar at the back of the stage, there was always a huge cross with Jesus on it. He was there dead. So every time I went in, I had the sense that Jesus died for me. Okay? But I also, because of the church teaching, I also believed that the death of Jesus was not enough. I can see that he suffered. He looks gruesome up there. You know, he's hanging on this cross. This is horrible. However, thanks Jesus, but it's not quite enough. And so what I need to do is I need to sit through one of these Latin masses at midnight and suffer through that to gain some points, because the death of Jesus is not enough. And what I also have to do is I also have to go through these steps or do these religious things, or I have to help my the old lady that lives next door with her trash cans, or I need to buy some Girl Scout cookies, or I need to do these extra things in order to make sure that I am saved, because the death of Jesus is not enough. And that's a huge problem. Because in the Bible, what we're told and taught is that the death of Jesus is enough. I don't need to add anything to it or do anything to get that salvation. He already paid for it once and for all. But you see, I didn't know that. And God is here. Here's the overarching lesson here. Why no leaven? Why no honey? Well, we know the leaven, but why the honey? We're not exactly sure, but we just know we're not supposed to add to whatever God has already set up. God's told us to do it a specific way. See, for me to say, you know what, it's great that Jesus died, but I also need to do these other things, is to say, that's great that Jesus died, but thanks anyways, it's not enough, I'll save myself. If I'm going to do works and add things to it, then why did I need Jesus to die? I didn't need him to die. I could just do a bunch of good things and earn my way to heaven. But that was not possible. So Jesus died. His death is enough. Paid for everything. So when God tells them, don't add any honey to it. Don't add any honey. What we do is we say, okay, I don't know why. I really, really like honey. So this is kind of sad to me. But don't add anything, fine. We'll do it the way you want. If you're taking notes, you can write this down. We won't turn there, but in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, Paul said, your glorying is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? A little bit affects the entire thing. You know how when you're hanging out with your group of friends, and there's always that one that has to cause some trouble, and you're just like, oh, a little bit of leaven leavens the whole lump, and you're just like, man, like this. Why did I invite you? You know, or who invited you? A little bit of leaven leavens the whole lump. Verse 7 in 1 Corinthians 5, it says, therefore, purge out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, since you truly are unleavened. For indeed Christ, our Passover, was sacrificed for us. Therefore, let us keep the feast, not with old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. So it gives us an idea there of what the leaven, we have an idea of what the honey, but the leaven, we want to leave that out. Now, continuing on in Leviticus chapter 2, verse 12. As for the offering of the first fruits, and he's going to mention this real quickly, and then we'll get to it in our next section. But in verse 12, as for the offering of the first fruits, you shall offer them to the Lord, but they shall not be burned on the altar for a sweet aroma. And every offering of your grain offering, every offering of the grain offering, you shall season with salt. Some of you like that, like salt. I'm not crazy about salt. You shall not allow the salt of the covenant, the agreement of your God, to be lacking from your grain offering. With all your offerings, you shall offer salt. Salt. Why salt? It indicates corruption being removed and prevented. Salt is a preservative. Did you know that? Did you know that back in the old days before refrigerators, they used to pack their meat in salt? Okay. I like a good steak or whatever, but man, I mean, you can imagine it's packed in salt. It would have just been so very, very salty. We move into verse 14 down to verse 16 where we get the last of these grain offerings. It says in verse 14, if you offer a grain offering of your first fruits to the Lord, you shall offer for the grain offering of your first fruits green heads of grain. In other words, they're fresh, they've just been picked, roasted on the fire, grain beaten from full heads. And you shall put oil on it and lay frankincense on it. It is a grain offering. Then the priest shall burn the memorial portion, part of its beaten grain and part of its oil, with all the frankincense as an offering made by fire to the Lord. So all of these different forms of the grain offering could be given. Now, does anybody want to take a guess as to why there were so many different options?
Accessibility.
Meaning? Explain.
If you couldn't do one, you could do the other. And it just kind of covers all bases, perhaps.
It's exactly what it is. Yeah, it's two different things. That certainly is one of them. That's the big one. Accessibility. I mean, maybe. It's been a busy week. You got practice. You got homework. You got school. You got a midterm. Study. You got family stuff going on. Oh, and I want to go sacrifice, but I didn't have time to prepare it. But I can take it in fine flour form with some oil and some frankincense. Or maybe, hey, we just ain't got it like that, and we don't own an oven. Well, that's okay. You can bake it in a pan. Or you can fry it, stovetop, put it in a pan and fry that thing up. It's accessibility. The other thing that it does is that it removes any excuses. No one is excused. You can't say, well, I don't have any fine flour. Like I don't have a sifter. I couldn't get by the store and buy. No, it's accessible to anybody. Well, I don't have an oven, but there's no excuse because you can bake it in a pan. Well, I don't have a pan. Well, then you can put it in a frying pan. Everybody's got one of those, or you can bring it roasted. It's all these different forms. It's accessibility. And then it removes the excuse. Like, hey, I just don't have anything to give to the Lord. And some of us think that. Some of us think to ourselves, you know what? I don't have anything to offer to the Lord. Listen, when I was 20 years old, I got saved. My girlfriend was pregnant. My car was barely running. I was not working. I was getting unemployment checks. I was flunking classes in my junior college. I had nothing. Like scraps, just crumbs. I had nothing. But I was told that God would receive whatever I had. And so at the age of 20, look at the door. Everybody, quick. I gave what I had, whatever little bits I had, I gave those to God. And then God began to work and to produce and to change and to do all of that. Contrary to popular belief, I was not born a pastor. I didn't come out of my mom's body just, teaching the Bible already or dressed in these stupid clothes. I wasn't born this way. I didn't do any of this for the first 20 years of my life. I was not serving God. I didn't even know who God was. I knew about him, but I didn't know him. But I came with those little bit of scraps. And some of us think to ourselves, you know what, I don't have anything to give to God. Like, I'm not really smart, or I don't have any special abilities, or I can't play a sport real well, or I can't play an instrument, or, I don't know how to lead worship, or I don't know how to teach the Bible, or I don't know, I've got all of these excuses. And God is saying, hey, you just come the way you are. God will accept you and he'll receive you. And then he will begin to work and to change you and to make you who he wants you to be. But the lesson is we just come with whatever we've got. You just come and you give it to God. You offer it to him and watch what he does, how he begins to rebuild and piece it all together. Now, I want you to know something. We're going to read in a few minutes when we get to the end of our study. we'll read something from the book of Hebrews, but I want you to think about this. What we're seeing right now, the sacrifices, all of these different sacrifices, the burnt offering, the grain offering, in a moment we'll get to the peace offering. All of these are pictures of Jesus. Now, I don't know if you know this or not, so I'm going to tell you something. We're reading in the Old Testament. Jesus was not born yet. He's not born until the New Testament. Okay? So they don't have Jesus. They're making these offerings. But we're reading things that we're telling the people. They were pictures, almost like hidden pictures, kind of like here's a picture of who Jesus is, what he's going to do. So all of these offerings, these sacrifices are pictures of Jesus. In Hebrews, it calls them shadows. They're just shadows. You see them and it's like, I see the sacrifices, but it's like a shadow that's being cast from Jesus over here. So we see the shadows, and the shadows are really cool. The shadows would be like all of these sacrifices. Oh, this is really cool. It's interesting. But eventually I want to see the real thing. And then we turn to Jesus. So that's the idea. That's the purpose of all of this. Okay? So keeping that in mind, the flour ground down would give us a picture of Jesus and the suffering that he endured, the grinding, the wearing, how he suffered for you and I. The fire is related to that. Fire is always a picture of suffering. Jesus went through the fire of persecution, through the fire of suffering. Sometimes you and I go through the fire, and it purifies. Okay? But that's the idea. Why are all of these things, burned on an altar of fire? Why can't you just go up to the top of a mountain maybe and take the flour and sprinkle it? Or, why can't you do something? Why does it have to be done this? Go to the ocean. I really like the ocean, and I want to go out there and just sprinkle this stuff over the ocean. Why not? Because this is the way God set it up. But the fire was pointing toward the suffering that Jesus was going to endure. So even through this, we're seeing Jesus. Now, let's move on into Leviticus chapter 3. It's going to move very quickly. Leviticus chapter 3 is all about the peace offering. It tells us that in verse 1. When his offering is a sacrifice of a peace offering, if he offers it of the herd. Now, you need to know this. Sometimes it's called the peace offering. Sometimes it's called the fellowship offering. So the idea is that, I'm bringing this to God and we are going to have peace or fellowship with one another. Okay? Verse 1, when his offering is a sacrifice of a peace offering, if he offers it of the herd, that basically means a bull. Okay? You can bring a bull. Now, in chapter 1, those of you that were here last week, we talked about a bull, we talked about a sheep or a goat, and we talked about birds, turtle doves, or pigeons. All of those animals had to be what? Does anybody remember? A couple things that they had to be. No? Okay, that's good that you don't remember. First thing was they had to be male. So there's a difference here. In this one, in verse 1, we're told that this sacrifice of peace offering can be a male or female. And we're also told that he shall offer it without blemish before the Lord. Remember that from last week? They couldn't, you couldn't show up and, with this bull with 3 legs and be like, well, I can't really present this one at the fair for blue ribbon. I don't really know what to do with it. I mean, I was going to turn it into dog food, so I'll just give it to God. It's like, I don't know what else, so I'll just give it to God. Like sometimes when people want to give like an old couch to the church, hey, we got this old couch we want to donate. Really, what does it look like? Send you a picture, it's all dipped in, stuff's broken on it, stained, and you're like, thanks anyways, but we don't have any room, Like, you don't come with some animal that's like, well, this one ended, it was born and only had 1 ear, so, I don't know what to do with it, we're just going to give it to God. The offering that you would bring had to be without blemish, but the other benefit was it could be male or female. So maybe you had a bunch of animals and you didn't have very many males, but you had some females. You could bring one of the females this time. Maybe you think, man, I don't know if I can spare a male. Well, you have the option of bringing a female. But this is really cool. Let me tell you why. I know that you're dying to know. Male or female, and it's a bull. Now remember, I just got through telling you that these sacrifices are pictures of Jesus. Now it's easy to see when we're talking about a sheep or a lamb because Jesus was called the Lamb of God, sacrificial Lamb of God. And we go, oh yeah, I see it. But when we say a bull or a female bull or ox, whatever it was, how is that a picture of Jesus? Well, what happens is God changes it up here for different reasons, but one of those reasons being this, that he doesn't want us to focus on the animal itself and start worshiping the animal. In India, cows are sacred. Rats are sacred. You cannot kill those animals. That's not what God is doing here. God is not setting certain animals apart as being sacred. He's just saying these are acceptable. And all of these, it's just a sacrifice. It's an innocent sacrificial animal. It's a picture of Jesus who was innocent and he sacrificed for us. Shall bring it, offer it without blemish. Verse 2. And he shall lay his hand on the head of his offering. Does anybody remember why he's supposed to lay his hand on the head? Yes. It is to symbolically transfer my sin onto that innocent animal. So these animals, I lay my hand on the head of his offering, verse 2, and kill it at the door of the tabernacle of meeting, and Aaron's sons, the priests, shall sprinkle the blood all around the altar. Then he shall offer from the sacrifice of the peace offering an offering made by fire to the Lord, the fat that covers the entrails, in verse 3. And all the fat that is on the entrails. The fat? Really? Verse 4, the 2 kidneys. Anybody know what kidneys are? They're those things that kids have. These? Just kidding. Yeah. Yeah. 2 organs that everybody's born with. My mom only had 1 kidney. Did you want to know that? So what? I told you anyways. Okay? Kidneys. Listen. Verse, where in the world are we? Verse 4. The 2 kidneys and the fat that is on them by the flanks and the fatty lobe attached to the liver above the kidneys, he shall remove. And Aaron's sons shall burn it on the altar upon the burnt sacrifice, which is on the wood that is on the fire, as an offering made by fire, a sweet aroma to the Lord. Now, wait a minute. He's supposed to sprinkle the blood. Then he's supposed to take all of the fat, basically, from the animal and burn that. What a strange thing. Why did he do that? Great question. Let's move on into verse 6. If his offering is a sacrifice of a peace offering to the Lord, if his offering as a sacrifice of a peace offering to the Lord is of the flock. Now we're talking about a sheep or a lamb in verse 7. If he offers a lamb as his offering, then he is to do the same thing that he did with the bull. Exact same thing. Verse 12, told you we would move through very quickly. And if his offering is a goat, so he could bring a bull, a sheep, or a goat in verse 12, he would do all the same things. Look at verse 17. This shall be a perpetual statute throughout your generations in all your dwellings. You shall eat neither fat nor blood. Now, I told you earlier that what God is doing, one of the things that God is doing here is he's removing Egypt from the life of the Israelites. And he is for the first time. This religion, this sacrifice, had not been officially established. Other people had sacrificed, that is true. Abraham had sacrificed, other people had sacrificed. But this is the first time that he has officially given it to his people. This is their religion. So that's why he's being so specific in the details. This is what you need to do. And this is what you need to do in order to meet with me. You can't just come and meet with me. You've got to take your items. You've got to present them to the priest. And then the priest will take them and offer them. You don't go any further than that. So you can bring your items, but you still can't go beyond that. You cannot approach any closer. You hand it off to the priest. The priest then goes and mediates for you. So all of their sacrifice, all of their communication with God was always through a priest. Just like with Pastor Chris, before he was Pastor Chris, all of his communication with God was either through the priest or through a picture or a saint or a statue or a candle. It was always through some other form. I could not go to God directly. And for these people, they cannot just enter in and go talk to God whenever they want. Everything has to go through a priest. And so God is setting up all of these directions. But he's introducing them to this new religion. But I want you to understand something, that in verse 17, when he says, you shall eat neither fat nor blood. And earlier when he told them you've got to remove all of the fat and you've got to sprinkle the blood around. What he was doing even in that is he was separating his people from everyone else. Because you see, many of the other religions involved animal sacrifice. But oftentimes they involve the eating of the fat, which is just so juicy and tasty. That's where all the flavor is. But oftentimes it also involved the partaking of the blood, drinking of the blood, the ingesting of it. I mean, even now, today, there are still, there are some foods that you prepare with blood and all that kind of stuff. But what he was doing is he was separating his people from everyone else. Now, let's finish. You can turn there if you want, or you can just hang out and I'll read it to you. Hebrews chapter 10. If you're taking notes, you can write this down and read it later. Hebrews chapter 10, verses 1 through 10 says this. For the law, having a shadow of the good things to come. It's a shadow. All the things that we're reading about in the law were a shadow of good things to come. And not the very image of the things. They can never, with these same sacrifices, which they offer continually year by year, make those who approach perfect. Some horrible news. That these sacrifices that we're reading about never ended. They had to continually bring those things. Day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, the sacrifice had to be made. Next time we're together, we'll get into sin offerings that needed to be made by the priest for his own sin and then for the sins of the people. It had to be done daily. These things never stopped. And we're told in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 1, that the people who did it were never made perfect. It never ended. It was perpetual. Verse 2, he goes on to say, for then, would they not have ceased to be offered? For the worshipers, once purified, would have had no more consciousness of sins. But in those sacrifices, there is a reminder of sins every year. For it is not possible that the blood of bulls and goats could take away sins. Therefore, when he, talking about Jesus, came into the world, he said this. This is what Jesus said. Sacrifice and offering you did not desire, but a body you have prepared for me. In burnt offerings and sacrifices for sin, you had no pleasure. Then I said, this is still Jesus speaking, behold, I have come. In the volume of the book it is written of me to do your will, O God. Previously saying, sacrifice and offering, burnt offerings and offerings for sin you did not desire, nor had pleasure in them, which are offered according to the law. Then he said, behold, I have come to do your will, O God. He takes away the first. When he says he takes away the first, it means that Jesus took away the first. The first is what we're reading about right now, all of these sacrifices. He took away the first that he may establish the second. What does he mean by that? He means that Jesus came, sacrificed himself, sacrificial animal, once and for all. He's going to say that in just a moment. I'm getting excited, so I jumped the gun. But what it means is that Jesus fulfilled all. He didn't cancel it out or say that it's bad. He just fulfilled it all. And in verse 10, Hebrews chapter 10, verse 10, by that will we have been sanctified, set apart, through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. You see, Jesus died to pay for sins, and it was sufficient. It paid for all of our sins. And it was done once and for all. Once. It was enough to fulfill all of the need for all of the sacrifice. It was fulfilled. It was done. His sacrifice was sufficient once and for all. So when Pastor Chris was just a young man and he used to walk into the Catholic Church and see Jesus on the back wall hanging on that crucifix, and he would think to himself, that's great, thank you very much, but I still need to do some good works to try and save myself. Pastor Chris had it all wrong. Because the entire time Jesus had already done it. His death was enough to pay for every single one of my sins, past, present, future. And these sacrifices that we're reading about, why would we go to Leviticus? It's so boring, and oh man, blood and grain, and what is all of this stuff? It's all pointing us to Jesus. It's all pointing us to Jesus. And the fact that Jesus paid a price for you. He died. He suffered so that your sins could be forgiven when you believe in him. You placed your trust and you go, you know what, Jesus? I believe that your death was enough to pay for my sins and get me to heaven. So I don't need to go chase down old ladies to help them with their trash cans. And I don't need to go chase down the Girl Scouts and buy up all of their cookies. And I don't have to go to church and suffer through another one of Pastor Chris's sermons in order to get to heaven. This is not gaining you any points. There are no points to gain. Jesus already paid the price. And if you want your sins forgiven, what you do is you say, God, I know that you sent Jesus to die for sinners, to pay the price for sin. I want my sins forgiven. Give me a new start. That's what Paul said. Paul said, if you believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, you will be saved. Well, don't I have to take a pilgrimage to some other country, to the Middle East, or go to Israel, or visit Jerusalem, or don't I have to go, to the church and pray, or don't I have to go, visit sick people in the hospital, or, adopt some orphans, or, don't I have to do these other things? No, you can do all of those things if you want, but they don't have to be done in order to get you to heaven. What is required? Jesus was the sacrificial lamb, paid the price. What I need to do is, by faith, believe that that death was enough to pay for my sins. That's what the Bible teaches. You say, it's too easy. Exactly. God set us apart. Christianity is the only religion in the world that teaches that we're saved by the work of Jesus, not by our own works. Every other religion in the world, you have to earn a spot. You've got to get yourself, do enough good works to get yourself into purgatory, and then your family can pray you out of purgatory into heaven. Every other religion, you have to work at it to earn your spot, and hopefully you did enough that when you die, you can go to heaven. Christianity says heaven is there if you want it. You believe in Jesus. He paid for your sins. He was the sacrificial lamb. He did it because he loves you. He did it because God the Father loves you, for God so loved the world. Goes on to say in verse 17, John 3:17, for God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. Father, thank you so much for